Historical trauma is cumulative emotional and psychological wounding over the lifespan and across generations, and is grounded in genocidal and ethnocidal motives. Historical trauma adversely affects health, well-being, and is well documented among Indigenous communities.
People think that history should not be applicable today, but these traumas live in our DNA and within our children, and every day is a process of healing. And when that healing is not supported in our systemic systems and institutions, then it's just perpetuated.
Native populations in North America were estimated to be more than 60 million, but by the early 20th century, they were estimated to be fewer than 250,000. Native homelands were stolen and sold off to European settlers. Communities experienced a significant loss of Indigenous way of life, food systems, culture, language, spirituality, resources, sovereignty, and Indigenous communities were forced to assimilate.
There needs to be more representation and visibility for Indigenous cultures, Indigenous history, and the history of colonization from an Indigenous perspective. Because right now we're viewed as like villains when there is a whole slew of things that happened to us, and it was unfair and unjust, and never were we the villains.
Indian residential boarding schools further traumatized Native communities and generations. An estimated 85% of Indigenous children were taken from their families and imprisoned in boarding schools operating under the philosophy of the genocide of the savage, salvaged by assimilation.
I feel that students and families encounter barriers in our education system due to the lack of cultural understanding amongst us, as well as treating our children as their own individual person themselves and asking them questions about the culture, being more understanding of that.
Native children were severely abused physically, mentally, emotionally, sexually, and spiritually, and they were not even taught the basic U.S. white education standards.
I need to be able to see our languages, our cultures, our contributions incorporated into every building and all across the curriculum, not just in social studies, not just in history, but incorporating that into our sciences and our offering our languages and credit for that.
Like my son, he is into traditional things too in our culture, but also at the same time, he wants to learn more about basketball, and he wants to learn more about photography and all these other things that's not necessarily having to be culturally specific.
Native children died by the masses. The exact number of deaths is still unknown. Trauma experienced by Native people through boarding schools manifests in present-day Indigenous health and education inequities.
Since my grandmother and my mother's experience within education, I personally had a better educational experience than both of them. However, being the mother of 3 children who've gone through Minnesota public schools, it's still not enough.
Systemic injustices in education repeatedly traumatize Indigenous students, families, and communities, and lack Indigenous perspective, visibility, and representation.
My school had built a teepee to represent all of the Indigenous students. And while yes, some students and their cultures did live in teepees, Ho-Chunk people lived in wigwams, and only a few of the students could really represent and feel the same way I did. And it's hard to speak out on it because it's not a very diverse area, and it's just frustrating.
Academic institutions teach through a U.S. white-centric patriarchal lens and place little to no value on Indigenous knowledge, perspective, or education.
I had coworkers, teachers that were non-Native that would come up to me and ask me to teach to a standard because they weren't comfortable teaching about American Indians. And my response to that is, yes, I would be willing to do it, but it is completely unacceptable for our teachers to be in a classroom and not be willing to teach our histories, and it's their job. So step up, be an ally and do your job. Learn how to teach all children, especially our children.
Minnesota schools continue to leave Indigenous voices and representation from the curriculum.
Native students and families encounter barriers within our public school systems in Minnesota because we are ultimately underrepresented.
Lack of representation and small things such as just not being white, or even things such as generational trauma through both sides.
A lot of our barriers had to do with relating to one another and just understanding of what our culture is and cultural practices. A lot of misunderstandings, a lot of not knowing, because they know we get grouped up into we're just Native American, so we all have same practices.
And the current way academic success is measured is discriminatory. This is harmful and has adverse outcomes for Indigenous students' safety, well-being, and education.